Minecraft can be a difficult game, but if you want it to be a little bit easier, most people go to enchanting their stuff. That's why I'm going to be taking all of the enchantments from Minecraft and putting them in a tier list from S to D. Enjoy the video. First up, we've got mending. Now how mending works is that whenever you lose durability on either a tool or a piece of armor that has mending on it, when you gain XP, you will slowly start to gain that durability back. Now I think that this is a really cool ability and it does tend to be pretty useful. But I don't think that it's that great, considering that if you were to have something like diamond armor or netherite armor, chances are it's already going to have enough durability for you to beat the game with it. That's why I'm going to be putting it in a B tier. Next up, we've got unbreaking. Now how unbreaking works is that whenever you lose durability on either a tool or a piece of armor that has unbreaking on it, it will lose a much smaller portion of that durability instead. Now I think that this is a great ability, and for that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the A tier. Next up, we've got Aqua Affinity. Now how Aqua Affinity works is that whenever you go in water and you try and mine a block, you will mine it much faster if the armor that you're using has Aqua Affinity on this. Now I think that this is a very interesting ability, but it's not that great. For that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the C tier. Next up, we've got Blast Protection. Now how blast protection works is that if you were to be in the blast radius of an explosion like from a creeper or TNT, you would take a lot less damage. Now I think that this is a good ability, although a shield works perfectly fine to also block this damage. For that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the C tier. Next up, we've got Cursive Binding. Now how Cursive Binding works is that whenever you are to put a piece of armor that has Cursive Binding on, you won't be able to take it off unless if you die. Now yet again, this is just not a good thing, it just is all disadvantage, and for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the D tier. Next up, we've got Depth Strider. How Depth Strider works is that whenever you go swimming, when you have armor that has Depth Strider on it, you'll go much faster. Now this is a really good ability, although it's not that useful. Now for that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the C tier. Next up, we've got Feather Falling. How Feather Falling works is that whenever you are to take fall damage when a piece of armor has Feather Falling on it, you'll take much less damage. Now for me, that's a great ability because I consistently die to fall damage in the nether when I don't have access to water buckets. So for this reason, I'm going to be putting it in the B tier. Next up, we've got Frostwalker. How Frostwalker works is that whenever you are to stand near or on water, all the water that you're standing on and the water around you will turn into ice. Now I really like this ability because I think it's really cool, although it's not super useful, so for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the B tier. Next up, we've got Projectile Protection. How Projectile Protection works is that whenever you were to take damage from a projectile, you take a lot less damage. Now I would put this higher up on the list if you didn't have access to shields, because shields can block any projectile for a lot of damage. For that reason, I'm going to be putting this in the B tier. Next up, we've got Protection. Now Protection is a great enchantment, and it's very simple. You just take less damage. Now I think that this is a great enchantment, and for that reason I'm going to be putting this in the S tier. Next up, we've got Respiration. Now how Respiration works is that you simply just take less air when you're underwater. Now I think that this is a really cool ability, but it's just not that useful because I've never been in a situation where I've really needed extra air. For that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the C tier. Next up, I'm going to be looking at Soul Speed. Now how Soul Speed works is that you simply run faster on Soul Sand. Now I think that this is a really great ability because I get really annoyed when I have to walk on Soul Sand. Now of course this is a good ability, but it's not like A tier, S tier. For that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the B tier. Next up, we've got Thorns. Now how Thorns works is that whenever you are to take damage when a piece of armor you have has thorns, the mob that dealt the damage to you will also take some damage. Now I think that this is a really cool ability, and for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the A tier. Next up, we've got Bane of Arthropods. Now this is probably one of the more strange enchantments because you deal more damage and you give slowness to arthropods. Now this is just a really bad enchantment because the only arthropod that really matters is spiders, and for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the D tier. Next up, we're taking a look at Fire Aspect. Now how Fire Aspect works is that whenever you hit a mob with a Fire Aspect weapon, that mob will be ignited in fire. Now I really like this enchantment because fire does a lot of damage, and for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the A tier. Next up, we've got looting. Now how looting works is that whenever you kill a mob, it has a chance of dropping more than what it usually drops. For example, when you kill an enderman, it usually gives you 1 ender pearl, but with looting, it might give you 2 or 3 ender pearls. For that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the A tier. Next up, we've got impaling. Now how impaling works is that whenever you hurt a mob that naturally spawns in the ocean with a trident, it will deal more damage. Now I think that this is a cool ability, but it's just not that useful. For that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the C tier. Next up, we've got knockback. Now, knockback does exactly what it sounds like. It will knock the enemy back even further than what it usually does. So I think that this is a cool ability, but it's not great because you're never in a position where you really need to knock the enemy back further. For that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the B tier. Next up, we've got sharpness. Now how this enchantment works is that your weapons will simply deal more damage. Now this is a great enchantment, and for that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the S tier. Next up, we've got smite. Now how smite works is that your weapons will deal more damage to undead mobs. Now I think that this is a good ability, but it's just not that useful, and for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the B tier. Next up, we've got sweeping edge. Now how sweeping edge works is that the sweeping edge mechanic will deal more damage. Now I don't use the sweeping edge mechanic very often because I always try to crit the enemies that I'm attacking, and for that reason I'm going to be putting sweeping edge in the C tier. Next up, we've got flame. Now how flame works is that whenever you shoot an arrow with a flame bow or crossbow, that arrow will be ignited. Now I really like this ability because fire does a lot of damage to mobs. For that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the A tier. Next up, we've got infinity. Now how infinity works is that whenever you shoot an arrow with a crossbow or a bow, it won't take up any arrows. That means that you can use 1 arrow an unlimited amount of times. So I think that this is a really cool ability if you don't want to have to farm for arrows, and for that reason, I'm going to be putting it in the A tier. Next up, we've got loyalty. Now how loyalty works is that whenever you throw your trident is going to come back to you. Now I think that this is an interesting ability, but it's just not that useful, so that's why I'm going to be putting it in the C tier. Next up, we have Riptide. How Riptide works is that whenever you throw your trident underwater, it will launch you with the trident. Now I think that this is such a cool ability, and for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the A tier. Next up, we have multi-shot. How multi-shot works is that whenever you shoot an arrow with a crossbow, it will turn it into 3 arrows. Now I think that this is such a cool ability because it can help you kill the ender dragon much faster, and for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the S tier. Next up, we have power. Now what power does is it simply increases the damage of bows and crossbows. Now I think that this is so useful, and for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the S tier. Next up, we have piercing. How piercing works is that whenever you shoot a mob, the arrow will go through that mob and hit another mob behind it. Now I think that this is pretty cool, but it's just like, there's not many situations where you're actually going to have to use this, so for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the B tier. Next up, we have punch. How punch works is that it increases the knockback of arrows. Now I think that this is a cool ability because it helps if there's a lot of mobs coming closer to you, and for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the A tier. Next up, we have quick charge. How quick charge works is that it increases how quickly it takes to recharge a crossbow. Now I think that this is really useful because crossbows recharge really slowly, so for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the A tier. Next up, we have efficiency. How efficiency works is that it increases the productivity of your tools. I think that this is so useful for mining and other things like cutting down trees, so for that reason I'm going to be putting it in the S tier. Next up, we have fortune. How fortune works is that it's going to increase how many blocks you get from mining certain blocks, and luckily one of those blocks are ores. So this means that you can mine 1 diamond block and get up to like 6 diamonds from 1 block. I think that this is insanely powerful, and it for sure deserves to be in the S tier. Next up is lure. How lure works is that it's going to increase how quickly fish come to your fishing rod. Now I think that this is an alright enchantment, but it doesn't save too much time, and for that reason I'm already putting it in the C tier. Next up, we have silk touch. How Silk Touch works is that whenever you mine a block, it will give you its original form. So say you were to mine an iron ore block, it will give you the iron ore block, not just the iron ore. And I think that this is probably one of the most useless enchantments in the game, and for that reason, it's going in the D tier. That brings us to the end of our tier list. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe because it only takes a few seconds, but it helps me out a lot. Thank you so much, have a good day.